At 4 o'clock a.m., when most families were still asleep, the silence of the borderlands between Burkina Faso and Togo was broken. A long convoy of trucks moved slowly through the night, their engines echoing across the empty roads. To the untrained eye, it looked like ordinary transport, perhaps aid deliveries or farm machinery. But to the soldiers who had spent years guarding these desolate roads, something was wrong. Who moves humanitarian aid at this hour? Why take back roads instead of the main route? The scene felt like the beginning of a crisis, not the delivery of food or medicine. Captain Musa Kabore, a border officer on patrol, sensed the danger. In that moment, he faced the same kind of choice many men and women in uniform have faced throughout history: to ignore his instincts or to act on them. He acted. What he uncovered would send shockwaves far beyond Burkina Faso. By dawn, the truth was revealed. Inside those 57 trucks were not sacks of rice or boxes of medical supplies, but enough weapons to equip a modern army. AK-47s, M16 rifles, rocket launchers, grenades, anti-aircraft missiles, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The discovery was so vast, so staggering, that even seasoned commanders could hardly believe their eyes. This was not smuggling for profit. This was preparation for war. Think about that for a moment. 57 trucks, each packed with death, rolling through the dark toward a fragile nation already surrounded by instability. If those weapons had reached their destination, thousands of innocent families could have been caught in the crossfire. Villages could have burned. Children might have grown up not with books in their hands, but with rifles in their hands. This is where our story begins. With a single patrol in the dead of night, a decision made by one captain, and a nation on the edge of chaos. But as we will see, the real mystery was not just what was found inside the trucks, but who sent them, who paid for them, and what greater plan was waiting to unfold. If this moment already reminds you of times when freedom was tested in our own history, stay with us, because the truth behind these 57 trucks may shock you even more. The night of August 16th, 2025, would soon become one of the most defining moments in Burkina Faso's modern history. After Captain Musa Kabore raised the alarm, President Ibrahim Traoré quickly grasped the potential danger. He called General Ibrahim Zerbo, commander of the Special Forces, and gave a clear but cautious order: intercept the convoy, but do it carefully. The president understood that this was not an ordinary smuggling attempt. Something far larger was at stake. Drones and helicopters were sent into the sky to track the trucks. On the ground, Special Forces moved into position, setting up a covert ambush along the border road. The silence of the early morning was pierced by the sound of engines as the convoy approached. Then, at exactly 4:00 a.m., the road was blocked. The drivers panicked. Some tried to turn their vehicles around, but within minutes they were captured. The soldiers opened the first truck, and what they found stunned them to their core. Beneath sacks marked as aid supplies were rifles, grenades, and heavy weapons. It was not just one truck. Every single one was filled with tools of war. The inventory was almost beyond belief. 25,000 AK-47s, 10,000 M16 rifles, 13 million rounds of ammunition, 70,000 hand grenades, 2,500 rocket launchers, 400 anti-aircraft missiles, 50 tons of explosives, enough to arm not just a group of rebels, but an entire army capable of destabilizing a nation. When Captain Kabore called the president to report the discovery, his voice trembled. "Mr. President, "You will not believe this. These trucks are packed with enough weapons to equip an entire army." President Traoré's response was firm. "Secure everything. Do not lose a single bullet. And make the drivers talk. We must know who is behind this. Someone is preparing for war in Burkina Faso." Interrogations began immediately. The first driver to break was Marc-Antoine Zongo. Shaking with fear, he confessed that he had been told he was transporting agricultural machinery. The plan, he said, was to deliver the cargo to a warehouse in Togo, where it would be shipped overseas. As investigators dug deeper, it became clear that many of the drivers truly had no idea what they were carrying. They were pawns in a much larger game. The organizers, however, knew exactly what they were doing. Each truck had been dispatched from a different location at different times, and only just before crossing the border did they join together as a convoy. It was a carefully designed tactic to avoid suspicion. Forensic experts examined the weapons and uncovered partial serial numbers, even though many had been filed off. Using advanced tracing technology, they discovered that some weapons had come from the battlefields of Libya, others from Yemen, and some were brand new, straight from factories. The total value of the haul was estimated at more than $700 million. That figure raised urgent questions. Who had the resources to purchase such an arsenal? Who was planning to use it, and for what purpose? President Traoré convened an emergency meeting of the National Security Council. Around the table, the country's top leaders sat in stunned silence as the full inventory was presented. General Sadu, the Minister of Defense, could not believe the scale. "This is not a shipment," he said. "With this firepower, you could invade an entire country." Hussein Traoré, the Interior Minister, added grimly, "If these weapons had reached the wrong hands, Burkina Faso would be in chaos right now. Terror groups could have launched a long-term insurgency. Worse, this could have fueled a coup." The president stood and addressed the room. "This is not random. This is part of a much bigger plan to destabilize our country, just like Libya, Syria, and Yemen. But we are not asleep. We have just stopped something huge." He ordered Intelligence Chief Ouedraogo to expand the investigation immediately. Ouedraogo soon returned with another revelation. One of the captured drivers had provided a name and a destination. The weapons were bound for secret warehouses in Ouagadougou, the nation's capital, where they would be distributed to opposition groups and possibly traitors within the army. The operation was far from over. At dawn the next day, Operation Storm was launched in the capital. Simultaneous raids were conducted at 23 addresses. Weapons were discovered in 17 warehouses. Among those arrested were former ministers, retired generals, wealthy businessmen, and even foreign diplomats. All of them shared one thing in common: open opposition to the Traoré administration. The suspicion now grew stronger that this was not an isolated act of smuggling, but a carefully orchestrated plan backed by powerful forces. What began as a midnight interception on a dusty border road had turned into the exposure of a vast conspiracy. Burkina Faso was no longer dealing with smugglers. It was facing an attempt to ignite a war from the shadows. And yet, the most disturbing truth had not even been revealed. If the weapons alone were enough to shock a nation, the real question still lingered. Who paid for them, and what greater plot was about to unfold? The discovery of the weapons was only the beginning. Within days, investigators uncovered names that shook the nation. Among the arrested was François Bongo, a wealthy businessman with deep ties to politics and foreign companies. At first, he denied any involvement, but the pressure mounted. Finally, In a moment that would be replayed on screens across the country, he broke. With a trembling voice and tears in his eyes, Bongo admitted the unthinkable. The weapons were not just meant for smugglers or isolated rebels. They were part of a coordinated plan to overthrow President Ibrahim Traoré. He revealed that meetings had been held in Accra, instructions had come from Abidjan, approval had been given in Paris, and the final green light had been issued in Washington. The room where he confessed fell into stunned silence. For many in Burkina Faso, suspicion of foreign interference had always lingered in the background. But here was a man of wealth and influence, openly confirming that foreign powers had promised support to replace their government with a pro-Western administration. His words carried the weight of betrayal. To many citizens, it was proof that history was repeating itself, that the same tactics used in other African countries were now being deployed against them. President Traoré responded not with panic, but with determination. He called a nationally televised press conference. Behind him stood row after row of confiscated weapons, a towering wall of steel and firepower. Millions watched as he held up a stack of documents. 3 days ago, he said, we intercepted the largest weapons smuggling operation in our history. This was not just smuggling. It was part of a plan to destroy our nation from within. His voice grew stronger as he declared, imperialist powers still believe they can control Africa. They are wrong. We are awake now. The reaction was electric. Citizens flooded the streets, some with tears of relief, others with clenched fists of anger. Mothers held their children tightly, whispering prayers of thanks. A farmer in the crowd told a reporter, if these weapons had not been stopped, my village might already be ash and rubble. The atmosphere was one of both outrage and pride. Outrage at the betrayal from within, and pride that their leaders had acted before it was too late. International journalists fired questions at the president. CNN asked which countries were involved. He replied carefully that the investigation was ongoing, but some weapons had been manufactured in NATO countries. The BBC pressed about the masterminds. He confirmed that 17 individuals had been arrested, including former ministers and generals. Al Jazeera raised concerns about regional stability. He responded that this was not only an attack on Burkina Faso, but an attack on all of Africa, pointing out that similar plots were being uncovered in Mali, Niger, and Guinea. When asked by Russian reporters about national security, he declared that the army was on high alert and the borders were locked down. His tone was calm, yet unyielding. He knew that the eyes of the world were upon him. Perhaps the most powerful moment came at the end of the press conference. President Traoré played a video confession of François Bongo. On the screen, the businessman wept as he admitted, "They lied to us. They told us we were bringing democracy, but what we would have done was destroy our own country. We betrayed our people. I was wrong. I am sorry." The silence in the room was deafening. For many, it was no longer a question of speculation. It was undeniable evidence that a shadow war was underway. The people reacted with a mixture of rage and resolve. Protests erupted, not against the government, but against the idea of foreign manipulation. Crowds gathered in Ouagadougou chanting, "No more puppets, Africa must rise." Women raised victory cries. Elders lifted their hands in prayer. Young men and women promised to defend their nation if called upon. The spirit of resistance was alive, and it was no longer confined to political speeches. It had become the heartbeat of the streets. For older generations, this moment carried echoes of the past. Many remembered the legacy of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated decades earlier. To them, Traoré's defiance felt like a continuation of that unfinished struggle. To the youth, it was proof that their country was not destined to be a pawn in global politics. This unity of generations gave the nation a strength few could have imagined. Yet even as the nation rallied, a darker realization set in. If so much had already been uncovered in just a few days, how much more was still hidden? Who else was involved? What other plots were waiting in the shadows? The investigation was far from complete, and the risks were still immense. The story of the 57 trucks had become more than a tale of weapons. It was now the story of a people facing betrayal, a president confronting powerful enemies, and a nation choosing whether to bow to fear or to rise with dignity. The climax had been reached, but the final outcome was far from certain. The world was now watching closely, and the question was unavoidable. Would Burkina Faso stand alone in this struggle? Or would the truth finally force the world to admit what was happening in the Sahel? The arrests and the revelations that followed sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso. The discovery of 57 trucks filled with weapons was no longer just a story about smuggling. It became a national reckoning. Families across the country began to ask themselves what might have happened if Captain Kabor had not stopped the convoy that night. The thought was terrifying. With so many weapons waiting to be unleashed, entire regions could have been torn apart. Villages might have vanished in the flames of conflict. Thousands of children could have lost their parents or been forced into militias. The country had narrowly escaped a nightmare. Ordinary citizens felt both relief and unease. Relief that the plot had been exposed in time, but unease because the conspirators included some of their own leaders. Former ministers, retired generals, and wealthy businessmen were among those arrested. These were men who had once sworn loyalty to the nation. Now they stood accused of selling out their people for foreign backing and money. For many, the sense of betrayal cut deeper than the fear of the weapons themselves. If trusted leaders could turn against the country, who could be relied upon? The discovery shattered illusions and forced the nation to confront harsh truths about loyalty, corruption, and power. Politically, the consequences were immediate. President Traoré consolidated his authority by demonstrating that he was willing to confront both external enemies and internal traitors. Yet this also put him in an even more dangerous position. A leader who stops such a massive conspiracy does not only earn respect, he also earns the lasting enmity of those who failed. The arrests of powerful figures meant that entire networks of influence, both inside and outside the country, were suddenly exposed. Allies of the accused began to worry that they too might be implicated. This created tension within the political class, some of whom quietly distanced themselves from the administration, while others pledged loyalty more loudly than ever before. On the streets, however, the mood was different. Citizens rallied behind their president. Mothers carried their children to public squares to listen to his speeches. Elders praised him as a man who had saved their homeland from the fate of Libya or Syria. Young people saw in him a leader unafraid to confront the very powers that had shaped African politics for decades. A farmer from the northern region told reporters, "We were almost tricked into killing each other. Now we know who the real enemy is. It is not our neighbors. It is those who wanted to use us for their own plans." His words captured the spirit of unity that began to spread through the population. Still, the risks for civilians remained. With conspirators revealed and foreign hands accused, there was fear of retaliation. Would more attacks follow? Would sanctions or economic pressure be used to punish Burkina Faso for refusing to bend? Families whispered these questions to each other at night. They remembered stories of other nations that had resisted outside pressure only to suffer isolation or invasion. The burden of uncertainty was heavy. Some families began storing food and water in case of future unrest. Churches and mosques filled with people praying for peace. The nation was awake, but it was also anxious. Internationally, the exposure of the plot reshaped Burkina Faso's political standing. Allies like Russia, China, Turkey, and Iran voiced support, framing the discovery as proof that African nations had the right to defend themselves against manipulation. On the other side, some Western nations expressed outrage at the arrests of foreign nationals. Threats of sanctions began to circulate. Citizens feared that these economic pressures would strike hardest at ordinary families, just as similar sanctions had hurt civilians in other countries around the world. For older Burkinabe, the situation brought back memories of colonial rule, when decisions made abroad dictated their lives at home. For older Americans watching the story, it might bring to mind the Cold War years, when proxy battles were fought in faraway places, often leaving ordinary people to pay the heaviest price. Inside the country, political divisions deepened. Supporters of the administration framed the arrests as a necessary act of national defense. Critics whispered that the government might use the crisis to silence opposition. In the middle of these arguments stood the ordinary citizen, worried about jobs, food, and the safety of their families. Their future depended on how the political storm would be navigated in the weeks ahead. The events had revealed both the fragility and the resilience of the nation. Fragility, because a network of powerful insiders had been willing to betray their country. Resilience, because ordinary people chose unity instead of panic. Families who could have turned against each other instead stood side by side, determined not to repeat the tragedies seen in other parts of the region. As the dust settled from the first wave of arrests and revelations, one question hung over Burkina Faso like a shadow. The nation had uncovered a conspiracy of staggering scale, but was this truly the end of it? Or had they only scratched the surface of a much larger plan? The fear was that if one such operation could be uncovered, others might already be in motion. What happened next would determine whether Burkina Faso had won only a battle, or whether it had secured the chance to win the entire war for its survival. The revelations from Burkina Faso quickly drew international attention. What had started as a local security operation was now a global diplomatic storm. Western governments, particularly in Paris and Washington, reacted with anger when their citizens and alleged operatives were arrested. They demanded immediate release, warning of possible economic consequences if Burkina Faso did not comply. For many Africans, this reaction was confirmation of what they had long suspected. The same nations accused of involvement in the plot were now acting as defenders of those caught inside it. In contrast, other powers lined up to support Burkina Faso. Russia praised the country's right to defend itself and declared openly that Traoré had taken the correct path. China went further by offering security assistance and economic support. Turkey and Iran both condemned the smuggling as a crime against humanity. Venezuela's president even compared Traoré to Simon Bolivar, calling him a modern hero of independence. This divide revealed that the struggle over Burkina Faso was not only about one country. It was about the balance of power across Africa and beyond. For Americans watching this story unfold, the accusations carried a heavy weight. The confession of François Bongo had pointed directly at Washington. Whether one believed his words or not, the implication was clear. The United States, once again, was accused of trying to shape another nation's destiny. For older Americans, this echoed memories of the Cold War when the CIA played roles in Iran in 1953, Chile in 1973, and other nations where governments were overthrown or manipulated. The lesson of those years was that intervention often created more instability rather than less. To hear that similar claims were now being made in Africa stirred unease and reflection. In Africa, the press conferences in Ouagadougou were seen as moments of defiance, a leader refusing to bow. In the United States, reactions were mixed. Some viewed Traoré as a reckless leader making dangerous accusations. Others saw him as a man standing up for his people against overwhelming odds. The truth remained uncertain, but the images of weapons, confessions, and rallies could not be ignored. They told a story of a nation fighting for its survival, whether or not the world accepted every detail of the case. For Burkina Faso, the global reactions mattered greatly. Sanctions could cripple its economy, but support from new partners could open doors for independence. For the rest of the world, the story forced a question. Was this the return of old patterns of interference, or the beginning of a new era where small nations demanded their dignity on the world stage? If these events sound familiar, it is because history often repeats itself. The question is whether we will learn from the past, or watch the same mistakes unfold again in the heart of Africa. By the end of that extraordinary week, the people of Burkina Faso had witnessed both the depth of a conspiracy and the strength of their own unity. 57 trucks filled with weapons had been stopped. Leaders who plotted against their nation had been exposed. Foreign powers had been accused of pulling strings in the shadows. Yet out of this storm came something few had expected. Ordinary citizens discovered that their voices and their solidarity were stronger than the fear of chaos. Families who had once worried about survival now felt pride that they had defended their homeland from disaster. Still, the warning signs are impossible to ignore. The documents seized during the raids revealed that Burkina Faso was only one target. Mali, Niger, and even Nigeria were listed in similar plans. This was not just an attack on a single nation. It was part of a larger effort to redraw the future of the Sahel. The weapons had been meant to plunge entire societies into conflict. If such plots exist in one place, can we be certain they do not exist elsewhere? That question now hangs over Africa, and it is a question that should matter to the world. For the United States and its allies, the accusations bring a moment of reflection. If interference continues, will Africa repeat the tragedies of the past, or will nations finally be allowed to write their own destinies? For Americans who lived through the Cold War, the echoes are familiar. Powerful nations once fought proxy battles far from their own borders. The cost was always paid by ordinary families. The same risk now faces the Sahel. The lesson is clear. When the lives of ordinary people become pawns in larger games, no one truly wins. President Traoré's final words to his people carried both hope and defiance. He promised to melt down the weapons and forge them into school bells, to turn tools of death into tools of life. That image of transformation has become a symbol for more than Burkina Faso. It represents the dream of a continent that no longer wishes to be controlled from outside. It is a dream of dignity, justice, and peace. So the question remains, is Ibrahim Traoré a beacon of hope, or is he leading his people into greater danger? Perhaps the answer lies not only in Burkina Faso, but in all of us. If this story has made you pause and think about the meaning of freedom, justice, and dignity. Share your reflections. Let your voice become part of the conversation. History is not only written by leaders. It is written by people who choose to speak, to remember, and to stand for what is right. May this reminder of courage inspire us to believe that even in dark times, hope can still ring like a bell across the world.